Going to prison was a tradition in my family. My grandfather had served time for running a moonshine business that was one of the biggest employers in town until it was shut down. My father was a thief, a clumsy one who spent more time locked up than he did at liberty. I remember him being there for a grand total of 4 of my birthdays while I was growing up. And then there was my uncle. He was a fraudster whose life was saved from an angry mob more than once by an arresting police officer. I was an exception. I kept my nose clean, and a couple of months after my 23rd birthday, I was successful in my application to become a correctional officer. I was bursting with joy as I got ready for my first day at work. I still lived at home but would be moving out when my wages started coming in. At the front door, my mother told me how proud she was of me and handed over a packed lunch. My father was not there. He had passed away, and my uncle was missing and unmissed. As I set off driving, I was ready to focus on the future. It was a bitingly hot day and the roads were dusty and pitted. By the time that I arrived, my bones were well shook up, and my car was spattered with dirt and with flies that had been too slow to get out of the way. The prison was the only building for miles around, and as I climbed out of my cars, one of the neighbors padded past, its tongue hanging out of its mouth. But then the coyote paused, and I wondered if it was eyeing me up hungrily. It was a scrawny thing and no threat to me. I turned away. The staff parking space was outside of the prison, and I craned my neck to look up at the perimeter wall. Its concrete was old and cracked in places, but it was still a mighty impressive barrier against possible escape. Razor wire curled along the top of the wall, and there was an observation tower rising up highest of all. An officer in the tower watched me approach. I tipped my baseball cap and I smiled, but he did not respond. He just kept staring, his eyes hidden behind shades. I walked on. Reaching the staff entrance, I took a deep breath, and then I looked into a camera fixed on the wall above the door, pressed a button, and I was buzzed in. The glare of the day slipped away, and I was met by the smell of sweat, mingled with some kind of bleach. The air was thick with it. My eyes started to sting, and I was wiping my hand across them when I heard somebody say, "Nah, you'll get used to it." I blinked and looked at the man who had spoken. He was in his 50s, I would have guessed, and his gray hair was shaved short. He wore a smart uniform with a shirt that was a shade darker than his hair. A name badge on his shirt read, Riley. His hand was held out for me to shake. "Pleased to meet you, sir," I said. "I'm Jake." "Bill," he replied, "and the feeling's mutual. I'll be giving you your induction. It'll be a much more civilized introduction to the prison than the inmates get. There's no body search and no delousing, and the uniform is a lot smarter as well. So if you'll follow me, Jake, I'll show you where your locker is and you can park your cap and jeans and join the Gray Brigade." After getting changed into my uniform and stowing the key to my locker in my shirt pocket, I followed Riley along a ground-level walkway that echoed with voices calling out. Men were cussing, threatening, yelling vile things, but some were also pleading for help. These men sounded lost and scared and in pain. The cells they were locked in lined the walls of the levels above us. There were 6 levels in all, around a square central opening. I leaned over a rail at one point and I looked up, but all I could see was darkness. "How many inmates are there?" I asked Riley. He shrugged before replying. "Enough to keep us in a job for life." There were metal steps linking each level, and the boots of correctional officers sounded on them at regular intervals. Riley passed the base of one set of steps and led me to an elevator door. "Lesson 1, he said. "If an alarm goes off, no one is meant to use the elevators. Most likely cause of an alarm is an inmate disturbance, and for one of those, the available officers are meant to proceed on foot to the flashpoint. The steps get mighty busy then, so I wait for an elevator anyway. It's much less tiring, and by the time you get there, the trouble's likely over as well. And then he gave me a conspiratorial wink, and I decided that I did not like this man. I had become a correctional officer because I genuinely believed that I could help the inmates. If my actions helped someone turn their life around and never return to a prison, then I would be able to say that I had done a good job. And maybe a child would grow up with a father at home. It appeared to me already that Riley's attitude was very different. He was clocking on and clocking off and didn't seem to care at all about the inmates. As the induction tour progressed, my mood continued to sour. I was shown all 6 levels and then taken round an administration block that it could have been an office anywhere in this country. I had a 1-minute audience with the governor of the prison, a slender man in a cotton suit who smelt of cologne and did not once look me in the eye. And then Riley left me with an HR person. As he walked away, he smiled at me in a way that made my skin crawl and then said, "I'll catch you later, new boy." An afternoon spent watching mind-numbing presentations on legislation and health and safety followed, and that was it. My first day was over, and boy was I glad. The drive back was even hotter and dustier, and I did not go straight home. I did what working people the world over do after a lousy day at work. I went for a beer. The bar was quiet apart from the creak of the ceiling fan and a tune of the jukebox that kept jumping because the record was scratched. There was sawdust on the floor and likely a few teeth as well from the weekend, when the good old boys like to drive into town from their farms and drink a few beers and punch a few lights out. It being a weeknight, the only danger to health came from the hot dogs that were being served at a discount price because they had been on a grill for more than a month. I settled myself on a stool at the bar. All I wanted was a long, cold drink. The last thing I expected was a family reunion. Only here came my uncle striding through the bar's doors and towards me. His thinning hair was slicked back. I doubted that he needed to use hair gel. He had enough natural grease. And he was smiling at me, actually smiling and holding out his arms as if we were going to embrace. I would sooner get up close and personal with a cobra than him. "Jake," he said, "how's my favorite nephew?" "Better when you were out of my life," I replied. Undeterred, he sat on the stool next to me and ordered a drink. I turned to him. "Seriously, man," I said, "I want nothing to do with you." He took a sip of his beer, sighed, and said, "Oh, don't be like that. I'm only back in town for a couple of days. Just renewing old acquaintances and catching up on the news. Speaking of which, I've heard you become a pillar of the community, a correctional officer at my old alma mater." He smiled at his own joke. I scowled and snapped. "What of it?" He held his hands out wide as he said, "Oh, nothing whatsoever, apart from to say good on you. I just hope you're doing okay. Prison can be a tough environment for a thoughtful guy, whatever side of the bars that he's on. You know what I'm saying?" "Yeah, real tough," I muttered and stared into my drink. He put his now empty glass down. He was looking at me with his bloodshot eyes. He was an old man now, and he had thrown away his life on lies and shabby dreams. I felt sorry for him in that moment. I might even have bought him a beer. But before I could, he took a deep breath and said, "I'm in trouble, Jake. I owe money to some real bad people, and I needed a way to dig myself out of a hole. So I did the only thing that I could. I told the people that I owe that I'm related to a correctional officer, and that maybe he could be persuaded to do them a favor. They have a good friend who's in the prison who is real keen on escaping, and hey, I thought." I shot to my feet and cut him off. "Don't go there," I hissed. "If you think that I'm going to break the law to save your neck, then you are very much mistaken. In fact, the next thing I'm going to do is phone the police and tell them what you just said." He shook his head and said quietly, "You don't want to do that, Jake." I explained to the men that my nephew was an upstanding citizen, so it would need a really strong reason to help them. A cold chill ran down my spine. "What have you done?" I asked. "Oh, I took a ride with them earlier out to your home. Introduced them to your mother. She's with them now out of town, someplace that no one will find her. And she is safe, and she will continue to be so, long as you play ball. You need to help their friend break out of prison. That's where we're at. Take this burner phone, they'll use it to contact you." He placed a cheap-looking mobile by my clenched fist, and then his vile bargain laid out. He left the bar. There was no physical trail of slime, but there might as well have been. I was horrified and furious. Rage pulsed through my body. There was no way that I was going to do this, I told myself. No way. I started to phone the police half a dozen times, and then I thought of my mother, of what the men might do to her, and I hung up. My mind was racing. I stayed at the bar until it closed, nursing a drink, and then I walked the streets of my hometown. At dawn, I got back in my car and I drove to work. I had made the only decision that I could, to protect my mother, and I would break a man out of prison. I had no idea how, but I would have to find a way. I was just pulling up in the staff parking area when the burner phone rang. I answered. "Yes." The voice on the other end of the line was gravelly. "Do we have a deal?" "Let me speak to my mother," I said. The gravelly voice shot back with, "That's real sweet, but answer my question." "I'll do what you want," I replied through gritted teeth, though I don't know how I meant to do it. "Relax," he said. "We got a plan. A drug was smuggled into the prison for our mutual friend, a very special one that we acquired over the deep web. Now that we brought you on board, we'll get a message to him, and who will take it? It will make him seem sick real quick and real bad, and they'll need to take him to the hospital. You make sure that you go with him. No matter what the medics do, he'll get sicker and die. You wrestle his body out of the hospital, and then, here's the magic part, he'll come back from the dead. He was never a corpse. It was just the drug making him appear so. He'll be full of beans. You bring him to us, job done, and everyone walks away happy. Now you have a lovely day." And with that, the call ended. I slammed the phone against the dashboard and cursed. I could only hope that my mother was unharmed. I sat there for a while, trying to get some composure back. I was soaked in sweat, and I must have looked half crazed. Eventually, I climbed out of the car and headed for the prison. I felt nauseous and terrified of what the day would bring. I had just finished getting changed when Riley had appeared. "Jake, my boy," Riley said, "you look like the type to volunteer because you're keen to impress and slide up the ladder to success. Well, I have the perfect opportunity for you. One of the inmates has been taken ill. He collapsed in his cell, sweating and fitting and looking real green. The wardens called an ambulance and asked me to keep an eye on the prisoner when he's taken to the hospital. But how about I do you a favor? I'll let you go on my place." He was right in my face by now, and I could smell his bad breath, his stale sweat. I swallowed down bile that had risen into the back of my mouth and said, "Sure, why not? Anything to help." After all, Riley's laziness had just made a big piece of the plan fall into place. He grinned and slapped me on the shoulder. "You're gonna go far, Jake, my boy. Now go fetch our sick inmate and wait for him outside until the ambulance arrives. We don't want him expiring in our nice, clean jail." 30 minutes later, I found myself getting into the back of an ambulance. Riley had insisted that I stay handcuffed to the prisoner at all times, but once the doors of the ambulance were closed and he was out of sight, I unlocked the handcuffs and I sat back. Both paramedics were riding up front. I would have expected one to stay with the patient while the other drove. It was clear, though, that neither wanted to get too close to the man, and I couldn't blame them. He was skinny and shaven-headed and heavily tattooed. When he grimaced, I could see that he was even tattooed on his gums, and he was grimacing a lot, and moaning and shaking and sweating. He looked incredibly pale, like the life was draining out of him. I had no idea what dubious drug he had taken to fake his illness, but it seemed horribly real to me. In fact, if he was not actually seriously ill, then he deserved a statute. I imagined his acceptance speech. "I would like to thank my shady characters everywhere. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for you." And then I suppressed a hysterical laugh. I needed to hold it together for my mother's sake. By the time we arrived at the hospital and the prisoner was being strapped to a trolley to be wheeled inside, the sun was high in the sky. I could feel the heat coming off the tarmac through the soles of my shoes as I stood by him, supposedly guarding him. He had stopped moving by now and he just laid there. Harsh, irregular breathing escaped his lips and his eyelids flickered. I thought of how life is meant to flash before your eyes in your last moments, and I shivered, despite the intense heat. The paramedics pushed him through some double doors, using the trolley and the prisoner's feet like a battering ram. And then they steered the trolley against one side of a corridor and started to walk away. "Where are you going?" I called after him. Without looking back, one of them replied, "The ER is full. We're going to see when there'll be a space available." My shoulders slumped and I sat down in a plastic chair on the other side of the corridor and I waited. And I waited. More than an hour must have passed before a young, exhausted-looking man in scrubs had appeared. He looked at the prisoner, checked his pulse, and shone a little torch into his eyes. And then he turned to me and said, "I'm sorry, your friend is gone." And then he walked away. "He's not my friend," I said to the empty corridor, and I went back to waiting. I assumed that the man in scrubs would be doing some kind of paperwork to note the time and cause of death, and requesting the body be taken to the hospital morgue. But as the minutes ticked by, no one came. There was just me and the body on the trolley. I got to my feet and I took a deep breath. I could still have walked away, told the governor at the prison and the police that my mother had been kidnapped and that I was being forced to help a prisoner escape. But I didn't. I crossed another line. I wheeled the trolley and the body back out into the open. I wheeled him along for 10 minutes or so, the trolley rattling and hard to steer, and the body staring up at the bright blue sky through eyes the doctor had not closed. I reached a quieter part of the parking lot and saw a car that was the same make and model as my own. I had seen an article online once about how all these types of cars can be worked by the same set of keys. I remembered that now and tried clicking the doors to unlock, which they did. Add stealing a car to helping a prisoner escape from prison, I thought, and I unstrapped the body and manhandled it into the back seat. The engine started first time and we rolled out of the parking lot. I put the radio on. A country and western singer was lamenting the fact that his woman had left him and taken his dog. I changed channels, found one that had rolling news. I wanted to listen out for reports of a body being stolen from a hospital. As I drove, I kept glancing in the mirror at the body on the back seat. I recalled the words of the man with the gravelly voice clearly. "Now here's the magic part. He'll come back from the dead. He was never a corpse, it was just the drug making him appear so. He'll be full of beans." There was no magic on that tan fake leather seat. Just a shape that had once been a man, which was starting to smell real bad. I turned the air conditioning to full, but it didn't really help. The smell of death grew and filled the car, and eventually I had to pull over. I stood at the side of the road, dry heaving. A truck roared past and the driver sounded his horn. Apart from that, I was alone. I straightened up. This was a hideous mess. I was now on the run, a lawbreaker, and the man that I had helped break out was actually dead. That had not been the plan. I cussed to myself and paced up and down, desperately trying to think what I should do. First things first, I decided. I needed to get rid of the body, otherwise it would draw attention to me. I took my shirt off, wrapped it around my nose and face, and got back in the car. I steered it off-road and hoped the suspension wouldn't break, as we bumped over the cracked dirt of the empty land which lay all around. After a few miles, I figured that I had found a spot that would have to do. There was no sign of life, not even a coyote or a buzzard or a desiccated tree hanging on in there. I parked up. I didn't have anything to dig with other than my bare hands, so I used them to start clawing at the soil. It was exhausting and slow, but after a while, I had a shallow grave. I returned to the car and hauled the body out and dragged it over to its final resting place. I laid it out, closed its eyes because that seemed like a decent thing to do, and I sunk to my knees. I wasn't about to say a prayer. I was simply worn out and needed to find the strength from somewhere to cover the body up. I was about to start shoveling dirt when the body opened its eyes and asked in a weak voice, "What are you doing?" I fell backwards, sat there open-mouthed with shock. The honest answer to the question, "Burying you," was not something that I could bring myself to say. Instead, I said, "Helping you escape." The body smiled. He smiled. The man who, after all, was alive. I helped him to his feet, clasping his hands in mine. They felt disgustingly cold, and when he stood face to face, his skin looked worse than ever. And as for his smell this close up, it was all that I could do not to hurl on the spot. "Where to now?" he asked. "Well, we need to ask your friends that," I replied. I hadn't heard from them again. On the plus side, that meant they wouldn't know that I just tried to bury the man alive. But I really did need to speak to them, to let them know that I would be able to deliver the man to them, and then I could be reunited with my mother. I helped the man over to the car. He was very weak and could only shuffle along, dragging his feet painfully slowly along the ground. I sat him in the back seat and then went to retrieve the phone. The number that had called was showing an unidentified, and the signal out here was very weak, which meant that it was time to get moving again and get close enough to civilization to have a good signal and hope that they called soon. 40 minutes or so later, my hopes were answered. I had rejoined the highway when the phone began to ring. I answered before it made it to the second ring. "I have him," I said. "He's back from the dead." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I did not know whether the hiss I could hear was interference or breathing, and my patience was at a breaking point. "Are you there?" I yelled. "I kept my part of the deal. Now you need to keep yours." Finally, the man with the gravelly voice spoke. "Chill, dude," he said. "Your mom is fine. She says hello. But it'll be a little while long before you can see her. We've amended the plan. Your uncle was proven to be a liability, so we have removed him from the equation. Permanently. That means there's a little more heat on us than is ideal. So, what you're going to do for us is to drive our friend to a little shack that we know, just south of the borderline, and we'll meet you all there. It'll be quite the reunion, don't you think?" I bit my tongue. If I had told him exactly what I was thinking then, I would be putting my mother's life in more danger. So I just listened as he gave me directions to the shack and then hung up. I pulled up. My heart was beating fit to burst, and I needed a moment to take stock. The shack was a long drive, and there were no towns on the way. Just mile after mile of parched, empty earth. I checked the fuel gauge. There wouldn't be enough, and I needed water as well. I turned round to my passenger in the back seat and said, "Okay, I know where I'm headed now, but I'll need to try and find somewhere to stop off to get fuel for the car and fuel for me. Well, and you. I'm assuming that you're thirsty." His eyes were closed and his mouth was slightly open, and he didn't seem to have noticed a fat fly was crawling down his cheek. It continued on its way and disappeared between his lips. I shuddered and said, "Did you hear me? Are you thirsty?" His eyelids finally flickered open and he shook his head. "Not thirsty," he said in a hoarse whisper, "but hungry, very hungry." He looked at me with eyes that blazed with a dark intensity. My guts tightened, cramping with unease. I said nothing else, and I turned around and started the engine. We drove on and I saw nothing for a long time. It was like someone had reached down and wiped away all sign of humanity and left just layers of dust, stretching out as far as the eye could see. The fuel gauge was creeping down, the dial introducing itself to the red line. I had a pounding headache and my vision was blurring. I was badly dehydrated. Just when I was thinking that it was hopeless, a small cluster of shapes appeared ahead, on the right of the highway. It was a truck stop. Yes, I thought. I would have punched the air, but I didn't have the strength. I coasted onto the forecourt of the fueling station. There was a diner just beyond this, but it was closed and a spiderweb of cracks filled one of its windows. So I had to hope the booth next to the station sold water. An attendant wearing a t-shirt that rose up over his belly stood inside behind a counter. He put a piece of gum in his mouth and chewed it slowly, as I struggled to get the nozzle into my car, and then waited while the pump had what sounded like an attack of indigestion, before finally the petrol began to flow. And then I went to pay. Inside the booth, the air conditioning sounded like a death rattle, and the heat took my breath away. It was intense outside, but in here it felt malicious. Feeling dizzy, I walked up to the counter and took out a card. The attendant looked at me and pointed at a sign propped up on the counter that read, "Cash only, no credit, no beatniks." I sighed and dug around in my pockets until I found enough crumpled bills to cover the cost of the petrol. Do you have bottled water?" I asked before I paid. "Got a faucet out the back," he replied. After paying, I went round the back. Even though I was dehydrated, I needed to relieve myself and I could not face using the truly disgusting looking restroom. After apologizing to Mother Nature, I did what I had to do, and then splashed water on my hands and face and drank as much as I dared. It tasted foul. I hadn't been gone long when I returned to the car. The man had been sitting in the back seat, staring into space when I had gone out to fuel up, and I had assumed that he would stay like that. But the car was empty. I looked around. The door to the booth hung open and there was no sign of the attendant. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, I approached the booth and looked inside, and I was met by a grotesque sight. My passenger was knelt over the attendant and was biting him, and there was blood everywhere. I ran forwards, grabbed the man and pulled him away. "You crazy SOB, I yelled. "What do you think you're doing?" He seemed to be in some kind of daze and started to crawl away on his hands and knees. I exhaled deeply, leaned over and felt the attendant's neck. No pulse. "You killed him," I said, and I looked back but the man was gone, crawling back to the car. I chased after him and he was already inside. I was lost for words. This had spiraled out of control now. But I was already in so deep and there was no going back. I had to keep going until my mother was safe. I clambered back behind the wheel and started the car. We pulled away and I glanced back at the scene of the crime to see the attendant was standing just outside the booth. His eyes looked glazed over and he was covered in raw bite marks and blood, but he was back on his feet. Somehow. As I stared, he began to shuffle slowly forward. I turned my attention back to the highway, and I floored the accelerator. With the truck stop disappearing into the distance, I glanced at the man in the back seat. He was licking blood from his lips, and there were small lumps of meat in the blood. Not blood, I thought. It's flesh. A wave of fear and repulsion passed through my body. I gritted my teeth once more and drove. Over the hours that followed, my passenger drifted in and out of lucidity. Sometimes he spoke words that I could recognize, the odd phrase though nothing he said really made sense. At other times he would snarl, a sickening guttural sound that chilled me to the core. I tried to focus on the road ahead. The sun was sinking lower in the sky. Dusk was close. And then thankfully the shack came into view. It was a beat-up pile of tin and wood by the side of the road, and there was another car there with two men leaning against its side, and I could see my mother in the back seat. She was alive, a slim, fragile figure hugging herself. I said a silent word of thanks and I started to slow down. Almost there, I thought. And then the man in the back seat leaned forwards. I could feel his breath, hot and rancid, on my neck as he said, "I'm so hungry. How about I bite a bit off of you? A bit you don't need, say your nose or an ear. Or maybe a bit of brain. I saw a show on cable once where a man had no cerebellum, and he was fine. He did not need that part of his brain. Oh, his delicious brain." As he spoke it finally dawned on me what he was. I had been blind. How could I have not realized? He wasn't alive, he was still dead. A dead man in the backseat of my car, drool dripping from his mouth, his teeth bared, and about to attack me, as he had attacked the attendant at the truck stop. I slammed on the brakes and I leaped out of the door. The two men leaning against the car straightened up when they saw me. "We got a problem," one of them asked, and I recognized from his gravelly voice that he was the man that I had been speaking to. "No problem," I lied. "Your friend isn't here." And he was. He had managed to get the door open and he was shuffling towards the two men. They were smiling now and moving towards them, holding their arms out ready to embrace. They hadn't realized yet. Didn't understand this wasn't their friend anymore. He was a monster and he was ravenous, and now he was within biting range. He dug his teeth into the first one and then the other. Blood had begun to fly. The men were screaming and trying to fight him, but their efforts were useless, and moments later they were falling to the ground where they lay motionless. I took the opportunity to race to their car. My mother had passed out. Witnessing what was happening must have been too much for her. I lifted her and ran back to my vehicle, while the man that I had driven here stood there gorging himself. It was a hideous sight. I reached my car, gently placed my mother in the passenger seat and pulled the seatbelt over her to keep her secure. And then I heard the sound of groaning and I looked up. The two men who had been carrying moments ago were back on their feet, reanimated as the attendant had been. They were staggering towards me. The blood dripping down their faces and clothes shone in the remnants of the evening sun, their open wounds that glistened. The first man swallowed a final chunk that he had torn from one of them and then followed in their wake. I rushed around to the other side and started the engine. They were too close for me to reverse away, so I drove straight at them. Their bodies collided sickeningly with the front of the car, but I was through them. The windshield was smeared with blood. One windscreen mirror was broken off and one remained. I looked in it as I drove away. They were getting up. I accelerated. I had only one thought on my mind. I needed to get my mother to somewhere safe, somewhere far away from the zombies shuffling down the dusty highway in the fading light.